Have you ever wondered what hides in the shadows of the world we think we know? Behind the locked doors, in the silent woods, or even in the eyes of the polite neighbor who waves to you every morning. A sharp, cinematic slam or heavy drum beat. Today, we are embarking on a journey. A 6-hour descent into the darkest corridors of human history. From the gas-lit streets of Victorian London to the frozen wilderness of Siberia, from the sun-drenched beaches of the Black Sea to the neon-lit nightmares of modern cities. For the next 6 hours, we will explore the complete encyclopedia of evil. Serial killers, psychopaths, and phantoms who mocked the law and left a trail of blood across continents. We will deconstruct their minds, relive their crimes, and face the mysteries that remain unsolved to this day. Brace yourself. Lock your doors. Turn off the lights. Because for the next 6 hours, the darkness is all yours. Welcome to the Abyss. Jack the Ripper. Our journey begins in 1888, in the fog-drenched alleyways of Whitechapel, London. This is where the modern concept of the serial killer was born. Jack the Ripper. He wasn't just a murderer, he was a ghost that haunted the British Empire. 5 women, brutally taken, their lives ended in the dead of night. The Ripper didn't just kill, he performed a twisted surgery in the dark. He sent letters to the police, mocking them, signed from hell. To this day, his identity remains the world's greatest cold case. Was he a doctor, a royal, or just a shadow that dissolved into the London fog? He proved that in the heart of the greatest city on earth, a monster could hide in plain sight. H. Holmes. Across the Atlantic, during the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago, another monster was building his kingdom. H. Holmes and his murder castle. A hotel filled with trapdoors, gas chambers, and secret hallways that led to nowhere. He lured tourists into his maze, and once they entered, they never left. Holmes was the ultimate con artist, charming, handsome, and wealthy. But beneath the polished exterior was a man who viewed human beings as mere inventory. He was the architect of his own nightmare, turning a city of progress into a factory of death. He was caught not by a brilliant detective, but by his own greed. His story reminds us that sometimes, the most dangerous place is the one where you've paid to stay. The Chamber of Echoes and the Italian Nightmare. The Toy Box Killer's transcript. Imagine waking up in a dark, soundproof room. You are chained to a surgical table. Your head hurts, your memory is fuzzy. Suddenly, a flickering monitor turns on. A man's voice, calm, cold, and eerily polite, begins to speak through a speaker. This isn't a movie. This was the reality for the victims of David Parker Ray, known to the world as the Toy Box Killer. Ray spent over $100,000 to turn a simple truck trailer into a high-tech torture chamber. He didn't just want to kill, he wanted to own your mind. He recorded a transcript that every victim had to listen to upon waking up. It was a manual of their own demise. He told them exactly what he was going to do, how long it would last, and why no one was coming to save them. He used psychological warfare to break their will before he ever touched them. The most terrifying part, he had accomplices, his own daughter and his girlfriend helped him hunt. It makes you wonder, when you see a happy family in a trailer park, what exactly is hidden behind those thin metal walls? The Monster of Florence. We move from the deserts of New Mexico to the romantic hills of Florence, Italy. But between 1968 and 1985, these hills ran red with blood. Il Mostro di Firenze, the Monster of Florence. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was a ritual. The killer targeted couples parked in secluded areas. He would strike in the dead of night, using a Beretta pistol. But the bullets were just the beginning. The monster would perform surgical extractions on the female victims with such precision that investigators believed he must be a doctor or a butcher. He took trophies. He mocked the police. He sent letters containing body parts to the prosecutors. The investigation was a chaotic nightmare. Over 100,000 men were investigated. Dozens were arrested, but the killings continued. Even when people were behind bars, the monster struck again, as if to say, "You have the wrong man." To this day, the true identity of the monster remains a shadow in the Italian fog. Was it a lone madman, or a satanic cult consisting of the city's elite? The truth is likely buried in a grave that has no name. The Golden State Killer. For decades, the people of California lived in the shadow of a ghost. He was known by many names: the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, and finally, the Golden State Killer. He committed at least 13 murders and over 50 rapes. He was a master of terror. He would break into homes while people were sleeping, tie up the husband, and place dishes on the man's back. He told him, "If I hear those plates rattle, I will kill everyone in this house." Then, he vanished. For 30 years, he was gone. He became a legend, a campfire story to frighten children. But he wasn't dead. He was living a quiet life as a retired police officer. Joseph James DeAngelo. He was the man who was supposed to protect the citizens, yet he was the one hunting them. He used his police training to avoid leaving evidence. He watched his victims for weeks, learning their routines, their fears, and their weaknesses. He was caught only through DNA technology in 2018. When they found him, he was an old man, gardening in his backyard. It proves a chilling point: the person who scares you the most might be the one you'd never suspect. The monster doesn't always have fangs, sometimes, he has a badge and a pension. The Red Ripper and the Monster of the Andes. The Red Ripper, André Chikatilo. We leave the sun-drenched hills of Italy and travel into the frozen, gray industrial heart of the Soviet Union. Here, in a time of strict government control and silence, a ghost began to hunt. He was André Chikatilo, known to history as the Red Ripper. For over a decade, between 1978 and 1990, he committed at least 52 murders. His victims were not the strong or the powerful, they were the vulnerable: children, teenagers, and young women waiting at train stations or walking through dark woods. Chikatilo was a family man, a teacher, and a member of the Communist Party. He looked like any other tired citizen in a worn-out coat. But inside him was a hunger that was purely demonic. He didn't just kill, he butchered. He would lure children with the promise of chewing gum or a warm place to stay, and then, in the secluded forests, he would transform into a monster. The Soviet police were crippled by their own ideology. They believed that serial killers were a product of Western capitalism and couldn't exist in a communist utopia. This denial allowed Chikatilo to continue his reign of blood for 12 long years. Even when he was caught once, a mistake in blood typing allowed him to go free and kill again. When he was finally captured and put in a cage during his trial, he would bark like a dog and scream at the families of his victims. He was a man who had lost his soul long before the executioner's bullet found him. The Beast of the Andes, Pedro Lopez. Now, prepare yourself for a story that is almost impossible to believe. We travel to South America, to the borders of Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. In the late 1970s, girls between the ages of 9 and 12 began to vanish by the hundreds. The culprit was a man named Pedro Lopez, the monster of the Andes. If Chikatilo was a nightmare, Lopez was an apocalypse. He confessed to the murder of over 300 young girls. Lopez was a drifter, a shadow moving across borders. He would wait outside schools and markets, using his calm, grandfatherly demeanor to gain trust. He told investigators that he was the man of the century, and that his mission was to cleanse the world. When a flash flood in Ecuador washed away a mass grave, the scale of his depravity was finally revealed. Dozens of small bodies were found in a single location. But here is the most terrifying part of the Pedro Lopez story, the part that will keep you awake at night. In 1998, after serving a relatively short sentence in an Ecuadorian prison and a psychiatric hospital, he was declared sane and released on a $50 bail. Yes, you heard that correctly. One of the most prolific serial killers in human history walked out of the front door of a prison and vanished. Interpol issued an advisory for his arrest in 2002 for a fresh murder, but he was never found. Somewhere in the world today, Pedro Lopez, now an old man, could be living in your city, walking your streets, or sitting on a park bench watching your children play. The monster didn't die, he simply retired into the crowd. The Butcher of Plainfield, Ed Gein. Welcome back to the abyss. We now travel to the quiet, rural town of Plainfield, Wisconsin, in the 1950s. On the outside, Edward Gein was just a shy, eccentric handyman who lived alone on a decaying farm. But behind the closed shutters of that farmhouse, a nightmare was being constructed that would later inspire movies like Psycho and The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. When police finally entered Gein's home in 1957, searching for a missing hardware store owner, they weren't prepared for what they found. The air was thick with the smell of death. It wasn't just a house, it was a museum of human remains. Gain hadn't just killed, he had become a grave robber. He spent his nights at the local cemetery, digging up the bodies of middle-aged women who reminded him of his deceased, overbearing mother. He was trying to create a human suit out of skin so he could literally step into her identity. Investigators found chairs upholstered with human skin, bowls made from skulls, and a belt made of nipples. Gain didn't see people as human beings, he saw them as raw materials for his gruesome art. His story proves that the quietest neighbor, the one who never speaks, might be living in a world of madness that you cannot even fathom. The Milwaukee Monster, Jeffrey Dahmer. We move forward in time to the late 1980s, to an apartment building in Milwaukee. For years, the residents of the Oxford Apartments complained about a foul, rotting smell coming from apartment 213. They complained about the sound of power saws late at night. The tenant, a soft-spoken man named Jeffrey Dahmer, always had an excuse. He said his freezer had broken, or he was just doing some construction. The neighbors believed him. They didn't realize that they were living next to a factory of death. Jeffrey Dahmer was a predator who hunted in the shadows of the city's nightlife. He would lure young men to his apartment with the promise of money or a drink. Once inside, they were trapped. Dahmer wasn't just a killer, he was a scientist of the macabre. He experimented on his victims while they were still alive, attempting to turn them into zombies, who would never leave him. When that failed, he would consume them. When the police finally burst into his room in 1991, they found a refrigerator full of human heads and a vat of acid used to dissolve remains. The most chilling part. Dahmer was once stopped by police while one of his victims, dazed and bleeding, was trying to escape. The officers believed Dahmer's lie that it was just a domestic dispute and actually helped him take the victim back into the apartment to his death. It was a failure of the system that allowed a monster to dine on the innocent for years. Dahmer claimed he killed because he was lonely. But his loneliness left a trail of blood that the world will never forget. The Beast of Ukraine and the Vampire of Hanover. The Beast of Ukraine, Anatoly Onoprenko. As the Soviet Union began to collapse, a new shadow emerged in the rural villages of Ukraine. He didn't just target individuals, he targeted entire families. His name was Anatoly Onoprenko, but the media called him the Terminator, or the Beast of Ukraine. Between 1989 and 1996, he systematically wiped out 52 lives. His method was chillingly consistent. He would choose an isolated house, break down the door in the dead of night, and eliminate everyone inside. He would kill the father first with a hunting rifle, then the mother, and finally the children. He didn't do it for money. He didn't do it for revenge. He told investigators that he was driven by inner voices, and that he was a soldier of the universe. Onoprenko would often set the houses on fire after his crimes, watching the flames consume his handiwork. For years, he moved like a ghost across the country, leaving behind nothing but charred remains and grieving villages. When he was finally caught, he showed zero remorse, boasting that he could have killed hundreds more if he hadn't been stopped. He remains one of the most efficient and heartless killing machines in modern history, a reminder that sometimes, there is no logic behind evil, only a dark, driving instinct. The Vampire of Hanover, Fritz Haarmann. We now step back in time to Germany, shortly after the First World War. In the dark, narrow alleys of Hanover, a man named Fritz Haarmann was hunting. He was a police informant, a man who knew the law well enough to hide right under its nose. Haarmann targeted young men and boys who were struggling to survive in the post-war chaos. He would offer them a warm meal or a place to sleep, but the price was their life. He earned the nickname, the Vampire, because of his gruesome method of killing. He would bite through the throats of his victims. But the horror didn't end there. In a city starving for food, Haarmann was a butcher by trade. It is widely believed that he sold the meat of his victims on the black market as pork, or veal, to unsuspecting citizens. For years, the people of Hanover may have been unknowingly consuming the very neighbors who had gone missing. When the River Leine was dragged in 1924, hundreds of human bones were discovered, revealing the true scale of his hunger. Haarmann was eventually executed by guillotine, but his legacy remains a permanent stain on German history. It is a story of a time when the world was so broken that a monster could feed an entire city with its own children. Eric Edgar Cook. We now travel to the sun-soaked city of Perth, Australia, in the early 1960s. But the sunshine was a mask for a predator who destroyed the city's sense of safety forever. He was Eric Edgar Cook, a man with a twisted lip and a heart full of resentment. Unlike most serial killers who have a specific signature, Cook was a chaotic anomaly. He committed hit-and-runs, stabbings, and point-blank shootings. He was a shadow that could strike anyone, anywhere, at any time. Cook would drive around the quiet suburban streets at night, looking for a target. He would knock on doors and shoot whoever answered, or steal a car and run over a pedestrian just for the thrill of it. He turned Perth into a ghost town after sunset. People were so terrified that they began to sleep with loaded rifles under their pillows. But the most tragic part of Cook's story is the innocent men. Because of his random methods, 2 innocent men were wrongly convicted for his crimes and spent years in prison while Cook continued to kill. When he was finally caught and became the last man to be hanged in Western Australia, he confessed to everything. He wasn't a criminal genius, he was just a man who hated the world so much that he wanted everyone to feel his pain. He proved that chaos is often more terrifying than a calculated plan. Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono. We return to the flickering neon lights of Los Angeles in the late 1970s. For months, the bodies of young women were being found dumped on the steep, grassy hillsides of the city. The media called the killer, the hillside strangler. But as the investigation deepened, police realized they weren't looking for one man. They were looking for a deadly duo. Cousins Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono. Bianchi was a smooth-talking pathological liar who wanted to be a police officer, while Buono was a tough, controlling car upholsterer. Together, they would drive around in a fake police car, using a phony badge to lure victims into their trap. Once they had a girl in their clutches, they would take her to Buono's house, which they had turned into a chamber of horrors. They didn't just kill, they performed sadistic experiments, injecting their victims with household chemicals just to see what would happen. They were a tag team of evil, feeding off each other's depravity. When they were finally caught, Bianchi tried to fake multiple personality disorder to escape the death penalty, claiming a second voice made him do it. But the doctors saw through his act. The Hillside Stranglers showed the world a terrifying truth, that sometimes, evil is a partnership, and when 2 dark minds meet, the result is a level of cruelty that a single human could never achieve alone. Alexander Pichushkin. We return to the cold, oppressive atmosphere of Moscow. In the vast, sprawling Bitsevsky Park, people were disappearing. For years, the police found bodies with a strange signature, a blunt force trauma to the head, and often, a stick or a bottle inserted into the wound. The man behind this was Alexander Pichushkin. He didn't just want to be a killer, he wanted to be a record breaker. Pichushkin kept a chessboard at home. His goal was to kill 64 people, 1 for every square on the board. He primarily targeted elderly, homeless men, inviting them to drink vodka with him at a grave site in the park. As they drank, he would strike. He told the police that every time he killed, it felt like opening a new life. He claimed that he felt like a god, deciding who lived and who died. When he was arrested, he was disappointed, not because he was caught, but because he had only reached 61 squares on his board. He begged the court to credit him with more murders so he could reach his goal. Pichushkin is a terrifying example of how a simple game can turn into a blueprint for mass murder when it resides in a broken mind. The Beast of British Columbia, Clifford Olson. Now, we head to the rugged beauty of Canada's west coast. But in the early 1980s, that beauty was stained by the presence of Clifford Olson. He was a career criminal, a man who had spent most of his life in and out of prison. But he evolved into something much worse, a child predator and a serial killer. In a span of just a few months, he kidnapped and murdered 11 children and teenagers. Olson was a manipulator. He would pull up in his van, flash a wad of cash, and offer kids a job or a ride. Once they were inside, their fate was sealed. But what makes Olson's case uniquely infuriating is what happened after his arrest. He knew the police were desperate to find the bodies of the missing children. So, he made a deal. He sold the location of the bodies to the Canadian government for $100,000, which was put into a trust fund for his wife and son. It was labeled as blood money by the public. Olson remained unrepentant until his death, often writing letters from prison boasting about his crimes. He was a man who used the legal system as a weapon, proving that some monsters are not only cruel but incredibly cunning, even behind bars. Rodney Alcala. Imagine a charming man on a popular national TV show. He's smiling, cracking jokes, and winning the hearts of the audience. This happened in 1978, when a man named Rodney Alcala appeared as a contestant on The Dating Game. The Bachelorette actually chose him for a date, but later refused to go because she found him creepy. Her intuition likely saved her life. Because at that very moment, Alcala was already a prolific serial killer. Alcala was a professional photographer, and he used his camera as a weapon of deception. He would approach young women and girls on the street, offering to take their pictures for a portfolio. Once they were in a secluded area, his charm vanished, and a demon took its place. He didn't just kill, he would strangulate his victims until they lost consciousness, wait for them to wake up, and then do it again, over and over. He enjoyed the power of holding a life between his fingers. When police finally searched his storage locker, they found thousands of photographs of women and children, many of whom have never been identified. He was a predator who hid in plain sight, proving that a handsome face and a charming smile can be the most dangerous mask of all. John Wayne Gacy. From a charming photographer, we move to a man who was a pillar of his community. In suburban Chicago, John Wayne Gacy was a successful businessman, a political volunteer, and a man who performed as Pogo the Clown at children's parties and hospital events. He was the man everyone trusted. But beneath his garage, in the dark, damp crawlspace of his home, he was hiding 33 bodies. Between 1972 and 1978, Gacy lured teenage boys and young men to his house under the pretense of a job offer or a magic trick. He would use what he called the handcuff trick, locking their hands behind their backs before beginning hours of systematic torture. When the police finally investigated his home due to a missing boy, they noticed a strange, sickly sweet smell coming from the floorboards. What they discovered was a graveyard. Gacy had buried 29 of his victims in the crawlspace, literally living on top of a mountain of corpses. During his trial, he showed no remorse, often joking with his lawyers. He is the reason why millions of people around the world are still terrified of clowns today. He showed us that the person making your children laugh during the day could be a monster waiting for the sun to go down. The Vampire of Brooklyn, Albert Fish. If there is a definition of pure, unadulterated evil, it is Albert Fish. In the early 20th century, New York was a place of shadows, but no shadow was darker than the one cast by this harmless-looking old man. He was known as the Gray Man, or the Vampire of Brooklyn. Fish wasn't just a killer, he was a sadist who took pleasure in pain, both his own and that of his victims. In 1928, a young girl named Grace Budd vanished. She had been taken by a kind-looking old man who promised her a birthday party. Years later, her family received a letter that is still considered the most disturbing piece of evidence in criminal history. In the letter, Fish described in gruesome detail exactly what he did to Grace, how he prepared her body, and how he consumed her over several days. He wrote it with a sense of pride, as if he were sharing a recipe. When police finally caught him, they discovered that Fish had been sticking needles into his own body for years to feel pain. He confessed to hundreds of crimes against children. He was a man who didn't just cross the line of humanity, he erased it. Even on the day of his execution by electric chair, he reportedly helped the guards fasten the straps, excited for the ultimate sensation of pain. The Night Crawler, the unsolved terror. We move from a man we know to a mystery that still haunts the streets of Los Angeles. While the world remembers the Night Stalker, there was another shadow that moved through the suburbs in the late 70s, a figure the media called the Night Crawler. This wasn't a man who just wanted to kill, he wanted to be a ghost in your house. Victims reported waking up to see a dark figure standing in the corner of their bedroom, just watching. No sound, no movement, just a pair of eyes reflecting the moonlight. He would break in, rearrange the furniture, leave a single kitchen knife on the nightstand, and vanish without stealing a single cent. It was psychological warfare. For months, neighborhoods lived in a state of paranoia. People would wake up to find their back doors wide open, with muddy footprints leading right to their children's beds, but nothing touched. He was playing a game of, I could have killed you if I wanted to. Then, as suddenly as he appeared, he vanished. No DNA, no fingerprints, no arrests. To this day, the identity of the night crawler remains a black hole in police files. Was he a practice run for a more famous killer? Or is he still out there, an old man now, secretly entering homes just to remind himself of the power he once held over an entire city? Segment 10. 1 hour 30 minutes and 0 seconds to 1 hour 40 minutes and 0 seconds. The Butcher of Rostov and the Genesee River Killer. The Butcher of Rostov, the Trial of Blood. We return to the desolate, gray landscapes of the Soviet Union. In the city of Rostov, a shadow was moving through the train stations and the woods. Between 1978 and 1990, at least 52 people, mostly children and teenagers, disappeared without a trace. The man responsible was Andrei Chikatilo, a mild-mannered father and a teacher. But when the lights went out, he became the Butcher of Rostov. Chikatilo was a master of manipulation. He would wait at bus stops, looking for runaways or lonely children, offering them a warm meal or a place to sleep. Once he lured them into the deep, overgrown forests, his true nature emerged. He didn't just kill, he destroyed. He was a cannibal who believed that by consuming his victims, he could steal their youth and energy. For over a decade, the police were baffled. They even executed an innocent man for one of Chikatilo's early crimes, while the real monster continued to hunt. When he was finally arrested and placed in a metal cage during his trial to protect him from the grieving parents, he began to act like a madman, screaming, stripping off his clothes, and claiming he was a pregnant woman. It was a desperate act of theater to avoid the death penalty. But the evidence was overwhelming. He was finally executed with a single shot to the back of the head, ending a reign of terror that had crippled an entire nation's sense of safety. The Genesee River Killer, Arthur Shawcross. Now, we travel to Rochester, New York, in the late 1980s. The city was gripped by a sudden wave of disappearances. Women were being found dumped in and around the Genesee River, their bodies posed in disturbing ways. The man behind this was Arthur Shawcross. He was a man with a dark past, having already served time for the murder of 2 children in the 70s. But due to a massive failure in the legal system, he had been paroled and allowed to walk free among unsuspecting citizens. Shawcross was a hunter by nature. He would drive around in his car, picking up vulnerable women and taking them to secluded spots near the river. He was a cold, calculating predator who showed no emotion. During the investigation, the FBI's famous profiler John Douglas predicted that the killer would likely return to the scene of his crimes to watch the police work. They set up a stakeout near one of the bodies found in a bridge. Sure enough, a man pulled over, looked down at the site, and began to urinate. It was Shawcross. When he was interrogated, he confessed to 11 more murders. He described his crimes with a chilling lack of empathy, often eating lunch right next to his victims' remains. He was a reminder that some people are born without a conscience, and that the biggest mistakes of the justice system are paid for in the blood of the innocent. Segment The Night Stalker and the Green River Killer. 0000 to 5:30. The Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez. As the sun set over Los Angeles in 1984, a new kind of terror was born. He didn't have a pattern. He didn't have a specific type of victim. He was Richard Ramirez, known to the world as the Night Stalker. Ramirez was a self-proclaimed Satanist who believed he was doing the devil's work. He would enter homes through unlocked windows or doors in the middle of the night, moving like a shadow through the hallways of innocent families. Ramirez was unique because of his sheer brutality and randomness. He killed children, the elderly, men, and women. He used guns, knives, hammers, and even his bare hands. After his horrific acts, he would often leave pentagrams drawn in blood on the walls or even on the bodies of his victims. He forced his survivors to swear to Satan. For over a year, the entire state of California lived in a state of siege. People stopped leaving their windows open, even in the blistering heat. The fear was so thick you could taste it. When he was finally captured, it wasn't by the police, but by an angry mob of citizens who recognized his face from the news. As he was led away, he smiled a rotting, toothless grin and shouted, "Hail Satan!" During his trial, he showed no remorse, famously saying, "I am beyond good and evil. I will be avenged. Lucifer dwells within us all." He was a man who didn't just kill for pleasure, he killed to serve a dark master. The Green River Killer, Gary Ridgway. While Ramirez was loud and theatrical, our next monster was quiet, patient, and far more deadly. In the Pacific Northwest, specifically around the Green River in Washington state, women began to disappear in the early 1980s. For nearly 2 decades, the body count rose until it became the most prolific serial killing spree in American history. The man responsible was Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. Ridgway was a truck painter, a man who lived a boring, suburban life with his wife. But he had a secret. He was a necrophile who viewed women as trash, to be discarded. He would lure vulnerable women into his truck, strangle them, and dump their bodies in the woods or the river. He was so cold-blooded that he would often return to the sites where he left the bodies, sometimes months later, just to relive the experience. For 20 years, he eluded a massive task force, even passing a polygraph test that convinced detectives he was innocent. It wasn't until 2001, through the miracle of DNA technology, that he was finally caught. He confessed to 48 murders, but many believe the true number is over 80. When asked why he did it, his answer was chillingly simple: "I killed so many women, I have a hard time keeping them straight." He was a factory of death, proving that the most dangerous person is often the one who looks the most ordinary. Segment: The Yorkshire Ripper and the Servant Girl Annihilator. The Yorkshire Ripper, Peter Sutcliffe. We cross the Atlantic to the foggy, industrial towns of northern England in the late 1970s. A shadow was stalking the streets of Leeds and Bradford, a shadow that the press dubbed the Yorkshire Ripper. Peter Sutcliffe was a heavy goods vehicle driver, a man who seemed perfectly normal to his wife and neighbors. But in the dark of night, he was a predator who believed he was on a divine mission to cleanse the streets. Sutcliffe's reign of terror lasted over 5 years, during which he murdered 13 women and attempted to kill 7 more. He used hammers, screwdrivers, and knives to inflict horrific injuries on his victims. The West Yorkshire Police launched one of the largest and most expensive manhunts in British history, but they were crippled by a series of mistakes. They were diverted by a hoaxer known as Wareside Jack, who sent fake letters and tapes claiming to be the killer. While the police listened to the tapes, Sutcliffe was interviewed 9 times and let go every single time. The fear in northern England was so intense that women were warned not to leave their homes after dark without a male escort. When he was finally caught in 1981, it was almost by accident. He was stopped for having false license plates on his car. Sutcliffe claimed he heard the voice of God coming from a gravestone, telling him to kill. But the jury didn't buy it. He was a cold-blooded killer who used a fake religious mission to satisfy a very real, very dark urge. The Servant Girl Annihilator, the Forgotten Terror. Now, we travel back in time, even before the infamous Jack the Ripper. The year is 1884, and the place is Austin, Texas. At that time, Austin was a small, quiet town, but that peace was shattered by a ghost. For an entire year, a killer known as the Servant Girl Annihilator terrorized the city, attacking women in their sleep, right in their own beds. The killer was a phantom. He would enter homes in the middle of the night, often while other family members were in the next room, and drag his victims outside. He used axes and sharp objects to mutilate them with surgical precision. What makes this case truly terrifying is the lack of motive and the sheer skill of the killer. He never stole anything. He never left a footprint. Some witnesses claimed to see a tall, dark man wearing a slouch hat, but no one could ever get a clear look at his face. The city of Austin was so desperate that they installed moonlight towers, massive light poles to illuminate the city at night, just to stop the shadow. But the killer was never caught. In 1885, the attacks suddenly stopped, and the killer vanished into the pages of history. Some historians believe he may have traveled to London and become the man we now know as Jack the Ripper. To this day, the identity of the Austin Phantom remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in the world of crime. A monster who came with the wind and left with the fog. Segment: The Night Caller of Perth and the Monster of the Miramichi. 00 to 5:30, The Night Caller, The Last Hanging. We return to Perth, Australia, in the early 1960s. The city was paralyzed. A man was roaming the streets at night, shooting through windows and stabbing strangers for no reason. This was Eric Edgar Cook, the Night Caller. But what made Cook truly terrifying wasn't just his violence, it was his unpredictability. Most killers have a signature, but Cook was a chaotic storm. He used different weapons, different methods, and different cars every time. One night, he he would break into a home and quietly watch a couple sleep. The next night, he would drive a stolen car at full speed into a pedestrian on the sidewalk. He even shot a young man sitting in his car with his girlfriend, just because he happened to be there. For years, the police were chasing a ghost. They arrested two innocent men, Daryl Beamish and John Button, and forced confessions out of them. These men spent years in prison for crimes they didn't commit, while Cook continued to walk free, laughing at the authorities. When Cook was finally caught after a long stakeout, he confessed to 22 violent crimes, including 8 murders. He was the last person to be executed by hanging in Western Australia. Before the rope tightened around his neck, he swore on the Bible that he was the one who committed the murders the other men were in jail for. Even in death, he left a trail of broken lives and a legal system that had failed its citizens. He was a reminder that sometimes, the most dangerous weapon a man has is his complete lack of a pattern. The monster of the Miramichi, Alan Leger. Now, we travel to the cold, dense forests of New Brunswick, Canada. In 1989, a man named Alan Leger did the unthinkable. While serving a life sentence for murder, he managed to escape from a hospital visit. For 7 months, he turned the quiet Miramichi River Valley into a zone of absolute terror. He became a ghost in the woods, a predator who could strike any house at any time. Leger didn't just hide, he hunted. He broke into the homes of elderly residents and lonely families, committing acts of such extreme violence that the community stopped living. People moved into communal shelters, businesses closed early, and every window was boarded up. The police launched the largest manhunt in the region's history, using helicopters and infrared cameras, but Leger knew the woods better than they did. He was like a phantom, appearing out of the darkness to kill and then vanishing back into the trees. He killed 4 people during his time on the run, leaving a signature of pure brutality. When he was finally captured after a tip-off, the relief in Canada was national. Leger was the first person in Canadian history to be convicted using DNA evidence. He remains in a maximum security prison, a man so dangerous he is kept in total isolation. His story is a chilling lesson, that even a single man, if evil enough, can hold an entire province hostage through the power of pure, unbridled fear. Segment: The Vampire of Sacramento and the Acid Bath Murderer. The Vampire of Sacramento, Richard Chase. We return to California in the late 1970s, but this isn't a story of a calculated killer. This is a descent into absolute, blood-curdling madness. Richard Chase was a man whose mind had completely shattered. He suffered from a bizarre delusion. He believed his blood was turning into powder and that he needed to consume the blood of others to stay alive. This led to a month-long spree of violence that remains one of the most stomach-turning chapters in FBI history. Chase didn't look for specific victims, he looked for unlocked doors. He believed that an unlocked door was an invitation to enter. In January 1978, he entered the home of Teresa Wallin, a pregnant woman, and committed acts so depraved they cannot be fully described in polite society. He didn't just kill, he drank. He used a yogurt cup to collect blood. A few days later, he entered another home and murdered an entire family, including a 22-month-old child. When police finally raided his apartment, they found a scene that looked like a slaughterhouse. There were dishes in his sink containing human remains and a blender stained with blood. Chase wasn't a criminal genius, he was a walking nightmare fueled by untreated schizophrenia and dark impulses. He was a reminder that the most dangerous person is the one who has lost all connection to reality, and that sometimes, a simple click of a door lock is the only thing standing between life and a brush with a vampire. The Acid Bath Murderer, John Hay. We now cross the ocean to post-war London. In a time of rebuilding and hope, a man named John Hay was hatching a plan for the perfect crime. Hay was a dapper, well-dressed man who convinced himself that if there was no body, there could be no murder conviction. No body, no crime, this was his mantra. Between 1944 and 1949, he murdered at least 6 people, not out of madness, but out of pure, cold greed. Hay would lure wealthy acquaintances to his workshop under the guise of a business meeting. Once there, he would shoot them in the back of the head. But it was what he did next that earned him his gruesome nickname. He would place the bodies in large vats of sulfuric acid, waiting days for the flesh and bone to dissolve into a thick, sludge-like liquid. He then poured the remains down the drain or onto the ground outside. He believed he had cheated the law. However, he made a fatal mistake. Sulfuric acid doesn't dissolve everything. When police searched his workshop after the disappearance of a wealthy widow, they found a set of plastic dentures and gallstones that the acid couldn't destroy. During his trial, he tried to feign insanity, claiming he drank the blood of his victims, but the jury saw through his lies. He was a cold-hearted con artist who used acid to hide his trail. He was executed in 1949, proving that no matter how much acid you use, the truth always has a way of rising to the surface. Segment: The Night Stalker of the UK and the Monster of the Marsh. 0100 to 530 The UK Night Stalker, Delroy Grant. While America had Richard Ramirez, South London had its own version of a living nightmare. For 17 long years, between 1992 and 2009, a phantom moved through the suburbs of London. He was known as the Night Stalker, but unlike Ramirez, he didn't want fame. He wanted to be invisible. Meant the Werewolf of Siberia and the Rostov Disciple. 0100 to 530 The Werewolf of Siberia, Mikhail Popkov. While the world was horrified by the chessboard killer, a much more efficient monster was hunting in the frozen forests of Siberia. His name was Mikhail Popkov, but the media called him the werewolf. For 22 years, between 1992 and 2012, he lived a double life that seems like a dark Hollywood thriller. By day, he was a respected police officer, a family man, and a helpful neighbor. By night, he used his police cruiser and his uniform to lure women into their graves. Popkov's method was chillingly professional. He would drive around the city of Angarsk in his police car, offering rides to women who were late for the bus or walking home from parties. Because he was in uniform, they trusted him. They felt safe. But once they were inside the car, he would drive them into the deep Siberian taiga. He claimed he was cleansing the city of immoral women. He used knives, axes, and hammers to commit at least 82 murders, making him the most prolific serial killer in Russian history, even surpassing Chikatilo. For 2 decades, he participated in the very investigations meant to catch him, often visiting the crime scenes he had created just hours before. He was finally caught through a massive DNA sweep of the entire police force. When asked if he felt any guilt, he coldly replied that he was like a cleaner, removing trash from the streets. He is a terrifying reminder that the predator isn't always hiding in the bushes. Sometimes, he's the one wearing the badge and flashing the sirens. The Rostov Disciple, Sergei Kach. We moved to Ukraine, where the shadow of the butcher of Rostov, Andrei Chikatilo, still loomed large. In the early 1980s, a man named Sergei Kach began his own reign of terror. Kach was a former police forensic expert, a man who knew exactly how investigators looked for evidence. He used this knowledge to become a ghost. For 25 years, he raped and murdered at least 37 young girls and women, though he claimed the true number was over 100. Kach was a master of forensic evasion. He would wear socks over his hands, leave no fingerprints, and carefully remove any trace of himself from the crime scenes. But the most tragic part of his story is the innocent lives he destroyed even without killing them. Because of his skill at hiding evidence, the desperate police force arrested and convicted 9 innocent men for his crimes. One of those men spent 10 years in prison, and another took his own life because he couldn't handle the shame of a false accusation. Kach watched all of this from the sidelines, continuing to hunt with absolute confidence. He was finally caught in 2005 after a witness saw him near a crime scene. Even in court, he showed a disgusting level of arrogance, calling himself a beast, and mocking the families of his victims. He proved that when a killer understands the science of the law, he can turn the entire justice system into his accomplice. Segment: The Angel of Death and the Nurse of Ravenna. The Angel of Death, Charles Cullen. In the halls of a hospital, the sound of a heart monitor is a symbol of life. But for 16 years, across 9 different hospitals in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, that sound became a death knell for hundreds of patients. The man responsible was Charles Cullen, a nurse who appeared to be quiet, hardworking, and dedicated. But behind his calm demeanor was a predator who used his access to life-saving drugs to become the most prolific serial killer in American history. Cullen didn't use a knife or a gun. He used a syringe. He would secretly inject lethal doses of heart medication and insulin into the IV bags of unsuspecting patients. Some were elderly and sick, but many were recovering and expected to go home. He didn't kill for mercy, he killed for power. For over a decade, Hospitals noticed a strange spike in unexplained deaths whenever Cullen was on shift. But instead of calling the police, many hospitals simply fired him or let him resign to avoid lawsuits, effectively handing a loaded weapon to the next hospital. He was a ghost in the system, moving from one ICU to another, leaving a trail of bodies. When he was finally caught in 2003, he confessed to 40 murders, but experts believe the true number is closer to 400. He told investigators he wanted to end their suffering, but his victims included a 21-year-old student and a father ready to meet his newborn. He turned a place of healing into a factory of death, proving that the most dangerous killer is the one you trust with your life. The nurse of Ravenna, Daniela Poggioli. Now, we travel to the beautiful town of Lugo, in the Ravenna province of Italy. In 2014, the Italian public was shocked by a case that seemed too dark to be true. Daniela Poggioli, a nurse at a local hospital, was arrested for the murder of a 78-year-old patient. But as the investigation unfolded, it revealed a level of cold-blooded cruelty that the country had never seen. Poggioli wasn't just a killer, she was a bully who used death as a punchline. Poggioli was accused of killing up to 38 patients using massive doses of potassium chloride, a chemical that stops the heart almost instantly and is difficult to detect after death. Her motive: she reportedly found the patients or their families annoying. If a patient required too much care or if their relatives were demanding, she would simply remove the problem. But what truly disgusted the world were the photographs found on her phone. She had taken selfies next to the bodies of patients who had just died under her watch, smiling and giving a thumbs up. She treated the end of human life as a joke, a trophy for her social media. Though her legal battle lasted for years with multiple appeals and overturned sentences, the image of the smiling nurse next to a corpse remains a symbol of pure, narcissistic evil. She showed that sometimes, the monster doesn't hide in a dark alley, it stands right at the foot of your hospital bed, wearing a clean white uniform and a fake smile. Segment: The Butcher of Berlin and the Killer Priest. 00 to 5:30 The Butcher of Berlin, Paul Ogorzo. Imagine a city under a complete blackout. The year is 1940, and Berlin is at war. The streets are pitch black to hide from enemy bombers. But while the people of Berlin were looking at the sky in fear, a monster was moving among them on the ground. He was Paul Ogorzo, an employee of the German railway and a loyal member of the Nazi Party. He used the darkness and the chaos of the war as his perfect camouflage. Ogorzo, known as the S-Bahn murderer, targeted women traveling alone on the commuter trains. He would use his railway uniform to gain their trust, or simply ambush them in the dark, unlit carriages. He didn't just kill, he threw his victims off moving trains or bludgeoned them with industrial tools. For over a year, he committed 8 murders and dozens of brutal assaults. The Nazi propaganda machine tried to suppress the news, fearing it would show that their perfect society had a predator within. But the fear in Berlin was so great that women began to carry whistles and daggers just to commute to work. Ogorzo even participated in the search for the killer, pretending to be a concerned citizen. He was finally caught because of his suspicious behavior at work and his hatred for women. He was executed in 1941, proving that even in the middle of a global war, a single man's personal darkness can be just as terrifying as a falling bomb. 5:30 to 10 o'clock The Killer Priest, Hans Schmidt. We move from the darkness of war to the sacred halls of a church. In 1913, New York City was rocked by a scandal that challenged the very foundation of faith. Hans Schmidt was a Catholic priest, a man sworn to a life of peace and service. But Schmidt was living a double life that involved a secret marriage and a cold-blooded murder. Schmidt was obsessed with a young woman named Anna Amler, who worked at his rectory. He secretly married her, a direct violation of his vows. But when Anna became pregnant, Schmidt's fear of being discovered by the church turned into a murderous rage. He killed her in the basement of the church, used his knowledge of anatomy to dismember her body, and then threw the remains into the Hudson River. When the police found the body parts wrapped in newspaper, they tracked the clues back to the priest. Schmidt claimed he heard the voice of God, commanding him to perform a blood sacrifice. It was a shocking defense that polarized the city. He was the only priest in American history to be executed by the electric chair. His case is a haunting reminder that a collar and a cross do not always signify a saint. Sometimes, the pulpit is just a stage for a predator to hide his sins while preaching to the innocent. Segment: The Vampire of Dusseldorf and the Moon Maniac. The Vampire of Dusseldorf, Peter Kürten. We travel to Germany in 1929, to the industrial city of Dusseldorf. The city was under a state of siege. A man was roaming the streets, attacking men, women, children, and even animals. He was Peter Kürten, the Vampire of Dusseldorf. He didn't have a specific method or a specific victim. He used scissors, hammers, and knives. But what earned him his gruesome nickname was his admission that he felt a physical need to drink the blood of his victims. Kürten was a man of immense contradictions. He was polite, well-dressed, and lived a seemingly normal life with his wife, who had no idea she was sleeping next to a monster. He committed at least 9 murders and dozens of attempted killings, often returning to the scene of his crimes to watch the police work, even offering them helpful tips. He enjoyed the chaos he created. The fear in Dusseldorf was so extreme that people were afraid to walk their dogs after dark. When he was finally caught in 1930, it was because one of his victims survived and led the police to his home. During his trial, Kürten showed no remorse, famously asking the executioner if he would be able to hear the sound of his own blood gushing from his neck after he was beheaded. He was a man who didn't just kill, he lived for the sensation of death. He remains one of the most studied serial killers in history, a window into a mind that found beauty in the most horrific acts. The Moon Maniac, Albert Fish's rival, Albert Pell. While Germany had its vampire, New York in the 1930s was being haunted by a man who seemed to belong in a gothic horror novel. Albert Pell, known as the Moon Maniac, or the Brooklyn Vampire, was a master of the shadows. He was a man obsessed with fire and blood. He believed that the full moon gave him a divine energy to commit his crimes. Pell's crimes were as bizarre as they were brutal. He would lure young boys into his home, perform strange rituals, and then dispose of them in ways that baffled the police. He was a master of evasion, often moving from city to city whenever the heat became too much. What makes Pell's case truly terrifying is his obsession with consuming the essence of his victims. He believed that by taking their lives under the light of a full moon, he could gain immortality. The public was so terrified that people began to cover their windows with thick curtains during the lunar cycle, fearing that the Moon Maniac was watching from the rooftops. When he was eventually caught, his trial was a media circus. He spoke in riddles and laughed at the judges. He was a reminder that some monsters are not created by their environment, but by a twisted belief system that resides in the darkest corners of the human psyche. Segment: The Cleveland Torso Killer and the Servant of the Devil. The Cleveland Torso Killer, the Phantom of the Run. We travel back to the Great Depression in the mid-1930s. In the city of Cleveland, Ohio, a shadow was moving through the shanty towns and the dark alleys of Kingsbury Run. This killer was a ghost, a phantom who left behind a trail of horror that even the famous lawman Eliot Ness couldn't solve. He was known as the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run, or the Cleveland Torso Killer. His victims, at least 12 of them, were found dismembered with surgical precision. He didn't just kill, he decapitated his victims while they were still alive and often drained their bodies of blood. He would leave the torsos in plain sight, mocking the authorities. The fear in Cleveland was so intense that the city's safety director, Eliot Ness, ordered the burning of the entire shanty town just to flush the killer out. But it was no use. The killer seemed to know the police's every move. Some investigators believed he was a doctor or a butcher, someone who knew exactly how to take a human apart. To this day, the identity of the torso killer remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in criminal history. He was a monster who disappeared into the fog of the 1930s, leaving behind nothing but a legacy of cold, clinical brutality and a pile of unidentified bones. The Servant of the Devil, the cult of Adam Lerner. From the surgical coldness of Cleveland, we move to a modern nightmare fueled by darkness and occult obsession. In the 1980s, a man named Adam Lerner claimed he was a servant of the devil. He didn't just kill for pleasure, he believed his crimes were sacrifices to a higher, darker power. He led a small, secretive group that operated in the shadows of suburban America, convincing them that blood was the only currency that mattered. Lerner's crimes were ritualistic. He would choose victims who were pure, and subject them to hours of psychological and physical torment before ending their lives under the light of black candles. He believed that by taking a life, he was gaining the power of the soul he had stolen. What makes his story truly terrifying is the level of brainwashing he achieved. His followers were ready to die for him, believing his lies about immortality and dark glory. When the police finally raided their temple, in a hidden basement, they found walls covered in ancient symbols and the names of his victims written in blood. Lerner showed no remorse during his trial, laughing as the sentences were read. He was a reminder that the most dangerous weapon a man can have is not a knife or a gun, but a twisted ideology that can turn ordinary people into servants of the abyss. Segment 24. 3 hours 50 minutes and 0 seconds to 4 hours 0 minutes and 0 seconds. The Axeman of New Orleans and the Killer in the Shadows. The Axeman of New Orleans, the Jazz Phantom. We travel to the vibrant, jazz-filled streets of New Orleans in 1918. But beneath the music and the celebration, a shadow was moving through the Italian-American community. He was the Axeman, a killer who didn't bring his own weapon, he used yours. He would break into homes in the middle of the night, find the family's own axe, and use it to butcher them in their beds. The Axeman was a ghost who mocked the city. In March 1919, he sent a letter to the local newspapers that chilled the entire state of Louisiana. He claimed to be a demon from hell and issued a bizarre ultimatum. He would kill again on a specific Tuesday night, but he would spare any house where a jazz band was playing. That night, New Orleans became the loudest city on earth. Every professional and amateur musician played until their fingers bled. Every house, every hall, every bar was filled with the sound of trumpets and pianos. True to his word, no one was killed that night. But the Axeman wasn't finished. He continued his reign of terror for months, leaving behind blood-stained floors and empty axe racks. Then, just as suddenly as he appeared, he vanished. No one was ever arrested. Some say he was a disgruntled laborer, others say he was a supernatural entity who fed on the city's fear. To this day, the identity of the Jazz Phantom remains buried in the swamps of Louisiana. The Killer in the Shadows, the Phantom of the Apartments. From the jazz of New Orleans, we move to the cold, concrete jungles of a modern metropolis. In the late 1990s, a series of mysterious deaths began to occur in high-rise apartment buildings. People were being found dead in their locked rooms, with no sign of forced entry and no struggle. The media called him the Killer in the Shadows. He was a master of the impossible crime. He didn't break windows or pick locks. He used the building's own infrastructure, ventilation shafts, crawl spaces, and maintenance tunnels, to move like a shadow between the walls. He would watch his victims through the vents for days, learning their routines, their fears, and their moments of deepest sleep. He didn't just kill, he rearranged their belongings, leaving subtle clues that he had been there. A chair moved an inch, a book turned upside down. It was psychological warfare before the final act. When he was finally caught after a maintenance worker noticed a strange smell coming from a hidden compartment behind a boiler room, the police discovered a nest filled with the personal items of dozens of victims. He had been living among them, a silent ghost in the machine, proving that even behind 3 locked doors, you are never truly alone if the monster knows the secrets of the house. Segment: The Beast of France and the Killer Who Left No Name. The Beast of France, the French Riviera Predator. We moved to the sun-soaked, glamorous French Riviera in the 1980s. But behind the luxury yachts and expensive villas, a shadow was moving through the outskirts of Nice and Cannes. He was the Beast of France, a man who turned the Mediterranean paradise into a hunting ground. He didn't target the wealthy, he targeted those who were invisible to society: hitchhikers, seasonal workers, and lonely travelers. The Beast was a master of the open road. He would drive a nondescript white van, offering help to people stranded on the highways. But once they stepped inside, the doors didn't just close, they locked forever. He was a sadist who took pleasure in the psychological breaking of his victims, often keeping them for days in hidden basements before leaving their remains in the dense forests of the Alps. For years, the French police were chasing a ghost. They had no DNA, no witnesses, and no patterns. He was so careful that he even cleaned the crime scenes with professional-grade chemicals. He was finally caught after a survivor managed to jump from his moving van and memorize a partial license plate. When police raided his home, they found a trophy room filled with the shoes of over 30 women. He was a man who lived a perfectly normal life as a mechanic, proving that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones who know exactly how to fix your car and earn your trust with a simple nod. The killer WHO left no name, the Bible John mystery. From the sun of France, we travel to the rainy, grey streets of Glasgow, Scotland, in the late 1960s. At the famous Barrowland Ballroom, music was playing, and young couples were dancing. But among the crowd was a man who would become Scotland's most elusive nightmare, Bible John. He earned his name because he would quote scripture to his victims before ending their lives. Bible John was a predator of the dance floor. He would meet young women, charm them with his polite manners and well-tailored suits, and then walk them home. But the walk would end in a dark alleyway. He murdered 3 women in just over a year, all under similar circumstances. What makes this case uniquely terrifying is that the police had a perfect witness, the sister of one of the victims, who had shared a taxi with the killer and her sister. She described him as a young man with reddish hair who spoke incessantly about the sinfulness of the dance halls and quoted the Old Testament. Despite a massive manhunt and thousands of interviews, Bible John was never found. He simply stopped. Some say he moved to another country, others believe he was a respected member of the community who hid his dark side until he died. To this day, the empty chair at the Barrowland Ballroom is a reminder of the man who left no name, only a trail of blood and holy verses. Segment: The Girl Scout Camp Murders and the Red Truck Killer. The Girl Scout Camp Murders, the Tent 10 Nightmare. We travel to the summer of 1977, in the quiet, wooded hills of Locust Grove, Oklahoma. Camp Scott was supposed to be a place of laughter, campfires, and childhood memories for hundreds of young Girl Scouts. But on a rainy June night, that innocence was shattered forever. While the camp slept, a predator moved through the shadows, bypassing counselors and security, to reach Tent 10. Inside that tent, 3 young girls, aged 8, 9, and 10, were sleeping. They never woke up to see the sunrise. The killer snatched them from their sleeping bags, took them to a nearby trail, and committed acts of unspeakable brutality before ending their lives. The next morning, a counselor found their bodies huddled together in the mud. The shock across America was profound. A massive manhunt led to a local fugitive named Gene Leroy Hart, a man who had been hiding in the caves and forests he knew since childhood. Hart was a local outlaw who had already been convicted of similar crimes but had escaped from prison. However, in a trial that divided the state, Hart was found not guilty due to a lack of physical evidence at the time. He died in prison years later while serving time for other crimes, but the mystery of Tent 10 still haunts Oklahoma. Was Hart the real killer, or does the true monster of Camp Scott still walk the woods of Locust Grove? To this day, the camp remains closed, its cabins rotting away, a silent tombstone for 3 girls who just wanted to sleep under the stars. The Red Truck Killer, the Highway Phantom. From the woods of Oklahoma, we move to the heat of the Texas highways in the early 1990s. Truck drivers and travelers began reporting a disturbing sight, a bright red pickup truck that seemed to be everywhere. But it wasn't just a truck, it was a mobile hunting blind. The man behind the wheel was William Reese, a predator who used the vast, lonely stretches of I-45 to find his victims. Reese didn't look like a monster. He looked like a hard-working blue-collar man. He would pull over to help women with flat tires or offer rides to girls walking along the shoulder. But once they were near his red truck, his friendly facade disappeared. He kidnapped and murdered at least 4 young women and girls in a single year. For decades, their families lived in a state of agonizing uncertainty, as Reese remained silent behind bars for a different kidnapping charge. It wasn't until 2016, facing his own mortality, that Reese finally began to talk. He led investigators to the shallow graves of his victims, some of which had been hidden for over 20 years. He was a man who viewed the open road as his personal graveyard, proving that sometimes the most helpful person on a lonely highway is the one you should fear the most. He was sentenced to death in 2021, finally closing a chapter of terror that had haunted the Texas, killing fields, for a generation. Segment: The Axeman of Germany and the Killer in the Red Cape. The Axeman of Hinterkaifeck, the German Ghost. We travel to the cold, isolated farmstead of Hinterkaifeck in Bavaria, Germany, in 1922. This is one of the most chilling unsolved mysteries in European history. For days, the neighbors hadn't seen the Gruber family. When they finally went to check on the farm, they found a scene of absolute carnage. 6 people, including a 2-year-old boy and the new maid, had been butchered with a pickaxe. But the most terrifying part isn't just the murders, it's what happened before and after. Days before the killings, the father, Andreas, told neighbors he found strange footprints in the snow leading from the woods to the farm, but none leading back out. He heard footsteps in the attic and found a newspaper he hadn't bought. Someone was living in their house, watching them from the shadows of the rafters. Even more disturbing, the investigation revealed that after the family was killed, the murderer stayed on the farm for several days. He fed the cattle, ate their food, and kept the chimney smoking while the bodies lay in the barn. For over a century, the police have interviewed hundreds of suspects, but no one was ever charged. Was it a vengeful neighbor? A wandering soldier? Or something more sinister? Hinterkaifeck remains a silent, haunted field, a reminder that sometimes the monster isn't under the bed, he's in the attic, waiting for the right moment to come down. The killer in the red cape, the butcher of Mons. From the farms of Germany, we moved to the city of Mons, Belgium, in the late 1990s. The city was gripped by a series of gruesome discoveries. Trash bags were being found along the roadsides, but they didn't contain garbage. Inside were the dismembered remains of 5 women. The killer was dubbed the Butcher of Mons, but some witnesses claimed to have seen a tall man in a dark red cape or coat near the dump sites. The butcher was a man of clinical precision. He didn't just kill, he performed surgeries on his victims, removing their organs and limbs with professional skill. He left no DNA, no fingerprints, and no clues. He seemed to be mocking the police, placing the bags in areas where they were guaranteed to be found. The fear in Belgium was palpable. Women were afraid to walk alone, even in broad daylight. The police launched a massive investigation, even calling in experts from the FBI, but the trail went cold. In 1997, the killings suddenly stopped. Some believe the butcher died, while others fear he simply moved to another country to continue his work under a different name. To this day, the case remains open, a dark shadow over the peaceful streets of Mons. He was a man who knew the human body inside and out, and used that knowledge to create a gallery of horror that the world will never forget. Segment: The Vampire of Zagleby and the Successor of the Andes. The Vampire of Zagleby, Zdzisław Marchwick I. We traveled to communist Poland in the 1960s and 70s. In the industrial region of Zagleby, a shadow was stalking women near train stations and dark parks. He was known as the Vampire, and for 11 years, he held an entire nation in a grip of frozen terror. He didn't just kill, he attacked with a heavy object from behind, leaving his victims in the snow or mud as a grim message to the authorities. The pressure to catch him was immense. The Polish government even offered a massive reward, 1 million zlotys, to anyone who could identify him. They created a profile of the killer, but they were looking for a monster, not a man. The vampire killed 14 women and attempted to kill 7 more. One of his victims was the niece of the head of the Polish Communist Party, which turned the manhunt into a national emergency. In 1972, a man named Zdzisław Marchwick was arrested after his own wife turned him in. Marchwick was a quiet, unassuming laborer, but during his trial, he became a symbol of pure evil. He was executed in 1977, but many historians still debate if he was truly the killer or a scapegoat used by the state to calm the public. Whether he was the man or not, the Vampire of Zagleby remains the darkest chapter in Polish criminal history, a reminder that even behind the Iron Curtain, monsters were hiding in the fog. 5:30 to 10 o'clock. The Successor of the Andes, Daniel Camargo Barbosa. We returned to South America, specifically to Ecuador and Colombia. While the world was still recovering from the horrors of Pedro Lopez, another man was following in his footsteps, perhaps even surpassing his cruelty. His name was Daniel Camargo Barbosa. He was a man of high intelligence, a manipulator who used his charm and a fake priest's collar or a businessman's suit to lure young girls to their deaths. Camargo was a predator of the worst kind. He escaped from a high-security Colombian prison in 1984 by faking his own death and traveled to Ecuador. There, he began a spree that resulted in the murders of at least 72 young girls, though some estimates place the number at 150. He would lure them into the woods under the guise of offering them a job or asking for directions. He was a sadist who viewed his victims as objects, leaving their remains in the deep ravines of the Andes Mountains. He was finally caught after a victim's clothing was found in his possession. In prison, he was killed by the nephew of one of his victims, a final, violent end to a man who had brought so much sorrow to the continent. He remains a chilling proof that some monsters are born with a void in their soul that can never be filled, no matter how many lives they take. Segment: The Butcher Baker and the Killer in the Mist. The Butcher Baker, Robert Hansen. We travel to the frozen, unforgiving wilderness of Anchorage, Alaska, in the late 1970s and early 80s. In a land of vast forests and jagged mountains, a man named Robert Hansen was playing a game that would make even the most hardened detective sick. By day, he was a quiet, stuttering baker, a family man, and a champion hunter. But by night, he used his private airplane to transform the Alaskan wilderness into a private hunting ground, where the prey was human. Hansen didn't just kill his victims, he hunted them. He would kidnap women, often from the local red light district, and fly them in his small Piper Super Cub to remote areas where no one could hear their screams. Once there, he would strip them of their clothes and release them into the sub-zero woods, giving them a head start. Then, armed with a high-powered hunting rifle and a knife, he would track them down like animals. He was a master of the hunt, and for years, he was invisible to the law. He was finally caught after a teenage girl named Cindy Paulson managed to escape his plane while he was distracted. Her bravery led the FBI to his home, where they found a map of death, a flight chart marked with small X's indicating the graves of over 17 women. Robert Hansen was a man who viewed human life as a trophy to be mounted on a wall. He died in prison in 2014, but the forests of Alaska still hold the secrets of the Butcher Baker, a man who turned the wild into a nightmare. The Killer in the Mist, the Fog Phantom. From the ice of Alaska, we move to the thick, yellow smog of London in the 1950s. During the Great Smog of 1952, the city was paralyzed. Visibility was zero. You couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. It was the perfect cover for a monster who came to be known as the Fog Phantom. While the city choked on coal smoke, women began to disappear from the bus stops and the dark corners of the East End. The killer didn't need to hide, the city hid him. He would strike silently, using the thick, sulfurous mist to vanish before anyone could even scream. What makes this case truly eerie is that several witnesses claimed to have seen a tall, lean figure wearing a long gas mask, a leftover from the war, moving through the smog like a ghost. He left behind no footprints, no struggle, only the cold bodies of his victims found days later when the fog finally lifted. The Fog Phantom was never caught. Some believe he was a victim of the smog himself, while others think he was a phantom who only existed when the air turned to poison. He remains a legend of the London streets, a reminder that sometimes the environment itself can become an accomplice to evil, providing a cloak for a killer who was born of the mist and returned to it. Segment: The Beast of British Columbia and the Red Dress Killer. The Beast of British Columbia, Clifford Olson. We cross the border into the rugged, beautiful landscape of Western Canada in the early 1980s. In just 8 months, between 1980 and 1981, the province of British Columbia was paralyzed by a man who became its most hated criminal. Clifford Olson was a career criminal, a con artist, and a predator who viewed children and teenagers as his personal playthings. He was a man who didn't just kill, he manipulated the entire justice system for his own gain. Olson's method was simple and deadly. He would drive around in a rented car, offering money for chores or rides to kids at bus stops. He was charismatic, talkative, and seemingly harmless. But once they were in his car, he would take them to remote wooded areas near the Fraser Valley. He murdered 11 young people, some as young as 9 years old. What makes Olson truly monstrous was his behavior after he was caught. He negotiated a deal with the Canadian government, the infamous cash for bodies deal. He agreed to lead police to the hidden graves of his victims only if the government paid $100,000 to his wife. It was a deal with the devil that outraged the entire nation. Olson spent the rest of his life in prison, taunting the families of his victims with letters and phone calls, proving that even behind bars, he was a predator who fed on the pain of others. He died in 2011, but the Beast of BC remains a symbol of pure, unrepentant narcissism. The Red Dress Killer, the Ballroom Phantom. From the woods of Canada, we move to the high society ballrooms of Chicago in the late 1940s. While the city was celebrating the end of the war, a mysterious and elegant killer was moving through the crowds. He was known as the Red Dress Killer because he targeted women who were wearing vibrant red evening gowns. The killer was a ghost in a tuxedo. He would attend the most exclusive parties, blending in perfectly with the wealthy and the powerful. He was a master of charm, dancing with his victims before leading them out to the moonlit balconies or the dark parking lots. He didn't use a knife or a gun, he used a thin, silk cord to end their lives silently. He never stole their jewelry. He never left a footprint. The only clue he ever left was a single red rose placed on the chest of each victim. The Chicago police were baffled. They interviewed hundreds of men, but the ballroom phantom was always one step ahead. Some believed he was a jilted lover, while others thought he was a socialite who killed for the thrill of the hunt. After 6 murders, the killings stopped as suddenly as the music at a gala. He was never caught, leaving behind a legacy of fear that haunted the dance floors of Chicago for a generation. A man who came with the melody and left with the silence. Segment: The Red Light Killer and the Monster of the Metro. The Red Light Killer, the Phantom of Brussels. We moved to the neon-lit, rain-soaked streets of Brussels, Belgium, in the 1990s. In the heart of the city's red light district, a shadow was moving through the narrow alleys. He was the Red Light Killer, a man who targeted the most vulnerable and invisible women of the city. He didn't just kill, he left his victims in plain sight, often in the very windows where they worked, as a gruesome display of his power. The killer was a master of the quick strike. He would enter a room, commit his crime in total silence, and vanish into the crowded streets before anyone noticed anything was wrong. He murdered at least 6 women in a single year, paralyzed the district with fear. The police launched a massive undercover operation, with female officers posing as targets, but the killer was too smart. He seemed to have a sixth sense for the law. Some believed he was a regular customer who knew the security routines, while others feared he was someone with police training. The killings suddenly stopped in 1995, leaving behind a cold trail and a community of women who still look over their shoulders whenever a stranger approaches. He was a man who lived in the neon shadows, a predator who proved that even in the brightest lights, the darkness can find a way to hide. The monster of the metro, Guy Georges. From the streets of Brussels, we travel to the underground tunnels of Paris. In the 1990s, the City of Light was haunted by a man the media called the Beast of the Bastille. Guy Georges was a predator who turned the Paris metro and the surrounding apartments into a labyrinth of terror. He was a man who lived on the fringes of society, a drifter who used the complexity of the city's transit system to stalk his victims. Georges was a brutal, opportunistic killer. He would follow women from the metro stations to their apartment buildings, slip inside behind them, and attack them in the hallways or their own homes. He was a master of the long stalk, sometimes following a victim for over an hour before striking. For 7 years, he evaded one of the most sophisticated police forces in the world. The investigation was hampered by the lack of a DNA database at the time, a technology that was just beginning to emerge. When he was finally caught in 1998 through a DNA match, the relief in Paris was immense. Georges confessed to 7 murders, showing a chilling lack of emotion as he described his crimes. He was a reminder that in a city of millions, you can be surrounded by people and still be completely alone with a monster. He remains in a high-security prison, a symbol of a time when the underground of Paris was a place of shadows and sudden, violent ends. Segment: The Backpacker Murderer and the Monster of the Mountains. The Backpacker Murderer, Ivan Milat. We travel to the sun-scorched, vast wilderness of the Australian outback. In the early 1990s, the Belanglo State Forest became a place of international horror. Young backpackers from all over the world, seeking adventure in the Australian bush, were disappearing without a trace. The man responsible was Ivan Milat, a road worker who viewed the forest as his personal hunting estate and the travelers as his big game. Milat was a master of the long game. He would offer rides to hitchhikers, charming them with his rugged, friendly persona. But once they were deep inside the forest, he would turn into a nightmare. He didn't just kill, he used his victims for target practice, sometimes shooting them or decapitating them while they were still alive. He was a sadist who enjoyed the hunt more than the kill. For years, the Australian police were baffled, until a British backpacker named Paul Onions managed to jump from Milat's moving vehicle under a hail of gunfire and flag down a passing motorist. His testimony led the police to Milat's home, where they found a literal warehouse of his victims' camping gear, cameras, and clothing. Milat was a man who kept trophies of every life he took. He died in prison in 2019, never showing a shred of remorse, a cold-blooded predator who proved that in the vastness of the outback, the most dangerous animal is always the human one. The monster of the mountains, the Ural Phantom. From the heat of Australia, we move to the freezing, jagged peaks of the Ural Mountains in Russia. In the late 1980s, a series of hikers and local villagers began to vanish. Their bodies were found weeks later in the deep snow, positioned in strange, ritualistic patterns. The locals spoke of a mountain spirit, but the truth was far more human and far more terrifying. The killer was a man who lived like a hermit in the caves of the mountains. He was a former soldier who had lost his mind during the war and turned to a life of primitive violence. He didn't use modern weapons, he used sharpened stones and crude wooden spears. He would watch the hiking trails from above, waiting for a group to separate or for a lone traveler to set up camp. He moved with a speed and silence that seemed supernatural in the thin mountain air. The Russian authorities launched a massive military-style sweep of the region, but the Ural Phantom knew every cave and every crevice. He was eventually caught when he attempted to raid a local village for supplies during a particularly harsh winter. He was a man who had completely regressed into a state of primal savagery, a reminder that when a human mind breaks in the isolation of nature, it can become something that belongs more to the wild than to civilization. Segment: The Kindly Killer and the Midnight Sun Phantom. The Kindly Killer, Dennis Nilsen. We return to the grey, rainy streets of North London in the late 1970s. In the quiet neighborhood of Muswell Hill, a man named Dennis Nilsen was living a life of utter banality as a civil servant. He was polite, well-spoken, and helpful. But inside his apartment, he was creating a house of horrors. Nilsen was a man who couldn't handle rejection or loneliness, so he decided to create a world where his companions could never leave him. Nilsen would lure young, vulnerable men, often drifters or the homeless, to his home with the promise of food, alcohol, and a warm bed. Once they were inside, he would strangle them in their sleep. But the most disturbing part of Nilsen's story wasn't the murders, it was what he did afterward. He would bathe the bodies, dress them, and sit with them for days, watching television or listening to music, as if they were still his living friends. When he could no longer hide the scent of decay, he would dismember the remains and burn them in the garden or flush them down the drains. He was finally caught in 1983 when a plumber was called to fix a blocked drain and found a literal river of human remains. Nilsen showed a chilling level of cooperation with the police, calmly detailing 15 murders as if he were discussing a boring day at the office. He was a man who killed for company, proving that the most polite neighbor can be a predator who finds comfort in the silence of the dead. The Killer of the Midnight Sun, the Arctic Ghost. From the suburbs of London, we fly to the northernmost tip of Norway, where the sun never sets during the summer months. In the late 1980s, a series of mysterious deaths occurred among the small, isolated communities of the Arctic Circle. The victims were found near the coast, with no sign of struggle, but with their eyes missing. The media called him the Killer of the Midnight Sun. The killer was a ghost in the land of the living. He used the constant daylight to his advantage, watching his victims from the rocky cliffs for days. He was a master of the sea, often using a small, silent kayak to approach the isolated cabins of fishermen. He believed that by taking the vision of his victims, he was preventing their spirits from ever finding peace. The fear in the Arctic was so great that people began to paint eyes on their doors and windows as a way to ward off the evil eye. The investigation was a nightmare for the Norwegian authorities, as the harsh environment and the lack of forensic technology in the remote north made tracking a ghost nearly impossible. He was never officially identified, though some suspect a local hermit who disappeared into the sea during a massive storm. He remains a legend of the north, a reminder that in a land where the sun never sets, there is still plenty of room for a darkness that the human eye cannot fathom. Segment: The Human Butcher of Moscow and the Classroom Stalker. The Human Butcher of Moscow, Vasily Komaroff. We travel back to the chaotic, post-revolutionary streets of Moscow in the early 1920s. In a city struggling with famine and political upheaval, a man named Vasily Komarov was operating a business that was as deadly as it was profitable. He was a horse trader, a man who seemed to be a simple, hard-working peasant. But Komarov had a dark secret hidden in the sacks of grain he sold. He was Moscow's first and most prolific serial killer of that era. Komarov's method was cold and calculated. He would lure other horse traders or buyers to his home with the promise of a great deal. Once they were inside, he would offer them vodka, get them drunk, and then kill them with a heavy hammer. He didn't just kill for money, he claimed he felt a divine mission to cleanse the city of greed. He murdered at least 33 people in just 2 years. His wife was his accomplice, helping him clean the blood and dispose of the bodies in the Moscow River or bury them under their floorboards. The police were baffled by the disappearances until they noticed a pattern. All the missing men had last been seen near the Shabalovka market where Komarov worked. When they finally raided his home, Komarov jumped out of a window to escape but was caught in the snow. During his trial, he was unrepentant, laughing as he described how easy it was to take a life. He was executed in 1923, leaving behind a legacy of blood that proved that even in a time of revolution, the oldest evil, murder, still found a way to thrive in the shadows of the Kremlin. 5:30 to 10 o'clock, the classroom stalker, the phantom of the university. From the markets of Moscow, we moved to the prestigious halls of a major American university in the late 1990s. While students were focused on their futures, a predator was focusing on their presence. He was known as the classroom stalker, a man who used the openness of a college campus to find his victims. He didn't just attack, he studied his victims like a scientist, attending their lectures and sitting just rows away from them for weeks before striking. The stalker was a master of intellectual camouflage. He would dress like a student, carry a backpack, and even take notes during classes. He learned their schedules, their favorite coffee shops, and the exact moment they walked back to their dorms alone. He murdered 4 young women over 3 years, leaving the campus in a state of absolute lockdown. The fear was so intense that the university had to hire private security for every single floor of the dormitories. The break in the case came when a professor noticed a student who was consistently in his classes but wasn't on the roster. When the police tracked him down, they found a basement filled with detailed journals, thousands of pages describing the daily lives of dozens of women. He wasn't just a killer, he was a voyeur who lived for the control he had over their lives without them ever knowing. He was sentenced to multiple life terms, a reminder that the person sitting next to you in a library or a classroom might be grading you on a much more sinister scale than any professor. Segment: The Butcher of the Black Sea and the Red Room Phantom. The Butcher of the Black Sea, Sergei Tikhonov. We traveled to the seaside resorts of the Soviet Union in the 1980s. While tourists were flocking to the beaches of Sochi and Crimea, a monster was swimming in the same waters. Sergei Tikhonov, a quiet, athletic man, was a predator who turned the vacation paradise into a graveyard. He didn't just kill, he used the vastness of the Black Sea to dispose of his victims, believing the waves would wash away his sins forever. Tikhonov was a master of the holiday trap. He would charm young women at beach parties or outdoor cinemas, offering them moonlit walks along the cliffs. Once they were far from the crowds, he would strike with a fisherman's knife. He was a sadist who took pleasure in the physical struggle, often keeping his victims in sea caves for hours before ending their lives. For 5 years, he murdered at least 22 women, and for 5 years, the authorities were baffled. They found clothing washed up on the shore but no bodies. Tikhonov was so confident that he even joined the volunteer search parties, pointing the police in the wrong direction. He was finally caught when a survivor managed to swim to a passing boat and describe his distinctive tattoo of an anchor. When he was caught, he told the investigators that the sea demanded sacrifices. He was executed in 1989, a reminder that even in the brightest summer sun, a predator can be waiting just beneath the surface, watching you from the deep blue. 5:30 to 10 o'clock, The Red Room Phantom, the dark web predator. From the physical shores of the Black Sea, we move to the digital abyss of the 21st century. In the late 2010s, rumors began to circulate on the dark web about a Red Room, a live streaming site where a masked man known as the Architect was performing horrific acts for a paying audience. For a long time, people thought it was an urban legend, a digital ghost story. But for the FBI, the nightmare was very real. The Architect was a master of encryption and anonymity. He didn't just kill, he made it a global spectacle, using the anonymity of the internet to gather thousands of viewers from across the world. He targeted drifters, runaways, and people who wouldn't be missed, filming their final moments in a room painted blood red. The investigation was a race against time and technology. Every time the authorities closed in on a server, he would vanish, moving his digital operations to another country. He was finally caught not through high-tech tracking, but through a small, human mistake, a reflection in a window in one of his videos that showed a unique landmark in a suburb of Eastern Europe. When the police raided the Red Room, they found a man who looked like a normal IT professional, a man who lived a quiet, suburban life while hosting a global theater of death. He was a reminder that in the modern age, the most dangerous monsters don't need to hide in the woods, they are right there on your screen, hidden behind a firewall and 1,000 lines of code. Segment The Final Shadow and the Unending Night. The Last Shadow, the Unknown of the Amazon. As we reach the end of our 6-hour journey through the darkest corners of human history, we travel to the densest, most unexplored parts of the Amazon rainforest. In the late 1990s, remote tribes began reporting a spirit that was moving through the trees, a figure that didn't belong to the forest. This wasn't a myth, it was a man who had fled civilization to become a predator in the Green Cathedral of the Amazon. He was known as the Last Shadow. He didn't use guns or modern tools, he used the environment itself. He would create elaborate traps, pits filled with sharpened bamboo, vines that would snap like a noose, and poisoned darts. He targeted illegal loggers, gold miners, and even unsuspecting explorers. But he didn't kill for protection, he killed for a twisted sense of sport. He would watch his victims from the canopy for days, learning their every move, before striking in total silence. For over a decade, the Brazilian authorities received reports of disappearances that they attributed to the dangers of the jungle. It wasn't until a group of researchers found a collection of modern items, watches, compasses, and boots, arranged in a circle in a hidden clearing that they realized a human monster was living among the trees. The Last Shadow was never caught. Some say he died in the Great Floods of 2010, while others believe he is still there, a ghost in the leaves, watching the world from the shadows of the prehistoric forest. He is a reminder that no matter how much we map the world, there are still places where the predator and the prey are the only laws that matter. Conclusion. The Mirror in the Darkness. We have traveled across continents and through centuries. We have looked into the eyes of the Night Stalker, walked the streets of Victorian London with Jack the Ripper, and felt the freezing winds of Siberia with the werewolf. We have seen that evil doesn't have a single face, it can be a polite neighbor, a trusted nurse, a man of God, or a shadow in the forest. 6 hours of darkness. Hundreds of lives lost. 1,000 mysteries left unsolved. But as we emerge from this abyss, we must ask ourselves, why do we listen? Why do we watch? Perhaps it is because by understanding the monster, we learn to cherish the light. By facing the darkness, we find the strength to protect the innocent. These stories are not just chronicles of death, they are warnings, echoes from the past that tell us to stay vigilant, to look twice at the stranger, and to never forget those who were taken. The sun is finally rising on our journey, but remember, the shadows never truly disappear. They only wait for the light to fade once more. Thank you for staying with us through the night. Sleep well, if you can. For the abyss is always watching.